But there's going to come a time when you're going to want to change some of those render settings. And those render settings can be changed by clicking this toolbar button here, Render Scene Dialog. And that will come up with the options. And your options, there's millions of options. We're going to have to save, an in-depth discussion of these options for a more dedicated rendering lesson, not intro, but I do want to discuss a few of these. First of all, you can say you can choose to render a single frame, which is what we've been doing, or animation. So if you've created some animation, you would want to save the active time segment. And the active time segment is just what is set down here. Or you can render a specific frame range, or you can render a specific set of frames. If you had some number of frames that failed, you could render 1 and 3 and then 5 through 12. So you might have to render some pickup frames that way. So you can render any combination of frames that you want. Now, when you render a single frame, it's just going to show up in the dialog box in the render view, and you can always get the render view back if you go to the rendering menu and go show last rendering. And then from here you can choose to save it out. You can copy this into the buffer. You can clone it, which is useful if you want to compare two images. You can also display just red, green, blue channels, or the alpha channel, of which there isn't any in this particular image. You can clear it. And then you can just, there's a color picker. If I right click in the frame, I'll see a whole bunch of pixel data, which is incredibly useful. Show me color values, and show me the data type that's in there, the width and the height, and all kinds of other so-called G-buffer data, if I choose to write that out. And then that color chip, that color goes into this color chip here, which I can then pick from or copy the color value, or etc., etc. All very handy. So then when I come down here, beyond that, I can see the output size. In the output size, you have some presets. So you have some presets that are set for various 35mm films, various aspect ratios of 35mm films. Where did it go? At the bottom, HD TV. That's a handy one. So HD TV is going to be 1920 by 1080. So if I want to choose from one of these presets, that's great. I can also do custom, and custom I can set the width and height to whatever I want. And then 3D Studio gives you some shortcuts here, which are kind of handy. What these shortcuts are, these are just various scalings of that same aspect ratio. So here there's full 1920, here there's 1280. So it gives you these various shortcuts. If you don't want to render, like for testing purposes, the full 2K frame here, which is probably a good idea to not, you can just render a quarter res or whatever that ends up being of that frame. Then you get a quicker preview of what you're looking at. So there's some various options there. Oh, and by the way, you can also set this to, once you get the aspect ratio, the image aspect locked, then you can set this to whatever you want, and it'll maintain the height to that width. Now, if you want custom widths, you can make this, 750 by 500, which is kind of one that I like. Image aspect of 1.5. And then you can choose to lock that. So you can set the aspect here, and it'll change your height based on whatever width you have set. Or you can lock the aspect, and then it'll give you various, permutations of that. So let's go back to HDTV. And then you have some options. So you can choose to render certain atmospheric effects if you want to turn off any one of these to speed it up. Like if you're just rendering a test animation or something, maybe you want to turn off displacement. It's not a bad idea. Or if you need to force every piece of geometry to be double-sided, if you have a lot of stuff that's, like if you imported some geometry from AutoCAD or something like that, sometimes the normals are all flipped around, and you just, to heck with it, I don't want to bother flipping all the normals back and unifying them all, so I'm just going to render the double-sided of everything. So you can force two-sided. Generally not a good idea to do that in terms of, render efficiency, but, what the heck if you're feeling lazy. And then down here you have render output. And this is key if you're rendering an active time segment. If you render an active time segment and you don't have render output save a file, it will ask you. So you're rendering a sequence with no assigned file, and what it'll do is it'll just render each frame into the render view, into the render buffer, and not actually ever save them out. So you'd be a total waste of time. So what you want to do is you want to check this Save File button, and then it'll ask you if there wasn't anything in there before. It'll ask you, and then you can say click this Files button, and it'll come up with a requester in which you can specify the output format. Don't really ever save out to an AVI. You want to render to frames and compress them later. Don't render out to a compressed format like JPEG. Again, you want to render out full quality frames and then compress them later, because if you spent, a day and a half or 2 days rendering out an image sequence to JPEGs, and then you look at the sequence and they're all compressed all to heck and all blocky and crappy, then you're going to have to re-render, as opposed to rendering out to a full resolution or full fidelity file, no lossy compression like SGI, like TIFF, like Targa. Those would be common ones that you could render to. Then compress them to JPEGs or AVIs or whatever, if that's what you want to do. So you can pick a file name, containers, a format. So we say it's going to save these as SGIs, hit save, then it'll get some options for that, whatever format you've chosen. So with SGIs, you can choose to shoot 8-bit or 16-bit or use alpha. 8-bit will give you, it's a lower bit depth than 16. 16 you'll have a higher color fidelity. Not a bad idea to render to, because then you can always convert that down to 8-bit. For display on the internet or whatever in Photoshop or something like that. So not a bad idea. They will be, file sizes will be bigger, but hey, hard drives are cheap, right? So click OK, and then you're all ready to go to render out an image a sequence of images, an animation or frame range. So you come over here. There's a bunch of other options up here. First of all, there's again, render elements of layers and things, ray trace options. These are all something that we're going to have to spend more time on later. But you have renderer specific options here. So if you go to renderer, you'll see what we're using and what we've been using is 3D Studio Max's default scanline renderer. And 3D Studio Max ships with, if you come down here and you go to assign render, you can have 3D Studio Max ships with a couple of different renders, actually. The main one that you might find yourself using is the mental ray render. It's an entirely different renderer, and with different rendering algorithms. Mental Images, who makes Mental Ray, is a whole separate company, and but 3D Studio Autodesk decided that they wanted to license their and include their render in with 3D Studio. And Mental Ray it's an incredible render, has tons of great features. You can choose to assign that render, and if you choose a Mental Ray render, then you get a whole string of different options that'll show up in a tab alongside here. So you can have, 3D Studio has several different embedded renders, and then there's even other renders that you can buy and add on top of those. So you could things like Final Render or Brazil, stuff like that. V-Ray, obviously, of course. You can purchase, and then when you install those, they'll show up in here as well. So you can render with any of these different renders, and then they have individual options that would show up in tabs in this render tab. So with 3D Studio's default scanline render, which is not a bad render actually, it's not the fastest render, let's say. The other ones are quite a bit quicker, especially when doing certain kinds of things. But in terms of quality, 3D Studio Max's is actually pretty good. That's what we've been using, and but it has some options. Some of the options that you might find yourself adjusting are that you can apply motion blur to things. You can do all kinds of things, but you can also have different filters, different pixel reconstruction filters. If we go back to, let's say, camera 2 here, this view, and then the default render of this, let me take that size down a little bit. I was rendering at full 2K. The default render of this is going to have a certain pixel reconstruction, which basically means the filtering of the image, how soft that image is. So your resultant render here is going to come up with a certain softness or certain sharpness. And with this filter area is actually a very soft filter. So if I change this to one of these other types, it'll actually kind of give you a description of what these what each one of these filters do. And 3D Studio ships with a bunch of these different kinds. Catmull ROM is a very common one, and it's very sharpening. So if you render out with Catmull ROM filter enabled, you'll get quite a different image actually. If you look at this, all of these details and stuff are going to be much sharper. You get a much more sort of resolved image and sharpness to the image. And Catmull ROM's a pretty good choice. That's one that I'll use quite a bit. But anyway, you can, play around with them and choose which one you like best. A lot of people will say use area and then sharpen after the fact, and that's not necessarily bad advice, but a lot of times we do render with Catmull ROM, which it's very sharp, but it doesn't give you any kind of artifacting typically. And like some of these other ones can give you. Alright, so I'm going to leave that at Catmull ROM. I'm going to close this. And actually I'm not. I'm going to reopen it. And you see, if you come down here, you see this little radio button which says Production or Active Shade. That's just a switch between two different kinds of rendering. Production will give you just what you would consider to be a final render. And Active Shade is a whole different way of rendering. What Active Shade does, and it'll have its own width and height, so you can set this to match what your production width and heights were. That's fine. And then it has a few other options for active shading. You can do various things with, but what Active Shade is for, if you just hit the Active Shade button, it'll come up with a different render view here. And you see it draws a red line, then draws a green line, and does a render. It's a little bit lower quality. And what you can do with Active Shade is you can close all of these and close that one. With Active Shade, let's say I'm going to pick this light here. Actually, let's pick lights and make sure I get that light. So I have a multiplier of 0.5. If I want to see what it looks like with a multiplier of 1.5, I can do an Active Shade, and I can make very fast adjustments to things like lights or colors or textures and things like that. Now you can't really change a camera and geometry. You have to re-update this Active Shade. But for doing things like seeing what it's going to look like with different colors or multipliers or shadows, even different settings. Some stuff works with Active Shade, some stuff doesn't. But if I wanted to just check and see what this looks like with quite a bit of a bluer tint to it, I can do that, and it'll sort of go red and then go green, and then it'll give me what that looks like if that light were tinted blue. So it's a sweet way to get pretty interactive changes to that kind of stuff. And you can get to Active Shade a couple of ways if you go there like I did before. Or here you have that Quick Render button is a flyout. And so you have Quick Render Production or Quick Render Active Shade. Okay, so if we close that Active Shade view and you go to the rendering menu, a bunch of stuff you can do in rendering here. One I want to talk about right now is environment. We already looked at the effects panel, and we're going to talk about environment. So I pull that up, and environment and effects are actually unified. You can get to them either way by comes up with the same box. It just has a different tab. Now environment, what I've already done in here is change the background color. So in your render you can change the background color to any color that you want. But if you want to add a picture, which is a very common thing to want to do, to your viewport background, you can just click environment map and it'll come up with bitmap. And you can map it to anything you want. You can map it to a checker pattern if you really want, but it's not ultimately that useful to do. So I'm going to browse through, pick that image, map it to the background. With the use map checked, which it will be by default, you can turn that on or off anytime you want. But with that checked, then when I render, I'll get a picture in the background. So I'm going to go back and click Quick Render Production Settings. And then I'm going to get that picture mapped to the background. And that's about it for introduction. I think we've modeled, we've textured, we've lit, we've rendered, and we even did a teeny tiny bit of animation. And I hope you learned something. Thanks for listening.